Imagine an opening strategy that turns conventional chess wisdom on its head. This is exactly what one of the greatest pioneers of hypermodernism, Gyula Breyer, does in the game we examine today. Instead of occupying the center with pawns, he invites his opponent to push pawns forward with tempo, giving away both space and time. From the classical perspective, this looks like complete madness. But Breyer has a deeper idea. He accumulates energy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His counterattack unleashes a chaotic storm of tactics. So let's dive into Breyer's incredible strategy and explore how breaking the rules can lead to triumph. Breyer's opponent was none other than the future world champion Max Euwe, who starts with e4. And instead of common pawn moves such as e5, e6, c5 and so on, Breyer plays the Nimzowitsch defense, knight c6. Although this defense is named after Nimzowitsch, Breyer also played it quite often and probably even before Nimzowitsch. Now the main line for white is d4, of course, occupying the center with the second central pawn. And in this case, black can either play d5, which is the most common reply, or maybe even e5. But as Breyer had a very big experience in this variation, it seems that Euwe wanted to avoid his preparation, so instead of common d4, he plays knight c3. And now Breyer had a chance to transpose to a common opening to the Vienna game with e5. But instead he keeps playing the revolutionary chess, provocative chess. He plays, instead of making a pawn move, he develops the second knight. And now Euwe occupies the center with the d-pawn. Now again, e6 or d6 looks more natural, but Breyer plays e5, attacking d4. And of course, white could have defended d4 by playing knight f3, or white could have pushed the d-pawn forward with a tempo crossing the center, but in this case the center would be closed and white would have only a slight advantage. But by playing e5, Breyer lets his opponent capture on e5, and that's exactly what Euwe does. That's the strongest and the most energetic way to continue. So Euwe wants to punish his opponent for his provocative move. So he captures on e5. Black must capture, after which Euwe pushes the f-pawn forward, grabbing space with a tempo. Grabbing more space. He already has one pawn in the center, and now the f-pawn also controls. So all these important squares are controlled by white. The knight must retreat, and Euwe grabs even more space. Now these squares are controlled by the pawn. Besides that, the knight has no squares to move except the initial square. It must retreat to the initial square. So at first sight, black's strategy looks suicidal. Besides a great space advantage, white also has the advantage in development. And Euwe develops the bishop, targeting the pawn. And only now we can see Breyer's idea. By provoking his opponent to push the pawn to e5, he has created a weakness. So this pawn, on the one hand, it's a strong pawn, but on the other hand, it's a far advanced pawn. It's far away from the remaining white army. So it's not so easy to hold this pawn. And Breyer immediately attacks it. d6, threatening to capture on e5 and win a pawn. And of course, it doesn't make sense for white to capture on d6, because after bishop takes d6, white doesn't have the pawn anymore, and it isn't clear what the f-pawn is doing on this square. Before, it used to defend the e5 pawn, and now it isn't doing anything. It just closes its own bishop's diagonal, and the king side is weakened. So, of course, Euwe didn't capture on d6. Instead, he defends his pawn by developing the knight. Now the pawn is defended, and Breyer keeps increasing the pressure on this pawn. He develops the bishop, pinning the knight, which is defending the pawn, and renewing the threat of d takes e. But Euwe defends his pawn indirectly. He castles, and now that the rook is on the f-file and f7 is weak, it turns out that black cannot execute his threat, d takes e would be a blunder because of a beautiful tactical idea. Bishop takes f7 check. A simple idea. After king takes f7, knight takes e5 check with the discovered attack on the black bishop. And if black captures the knight, which looks like the most natural move, it seems that the knight is defending the bishop is attacking the queen, but f takes e with the discovered check, and next move white will capture the bishop and win. For this reason, as d takes e doesn't work, Breyer plays queen d7, preparing the long castle. As the knight is pinned, Euwe unpins it and creates an X-ray, threatening d takes e with the discovered check. That's why Breyer castles. And it turns out that f7 is black's main weakness, which is already attacked once. And now, as the knight is unpinned, Euwe attacks it for the second time. And we have reached the critical position. At first sight, black's position looks almost hopeless. It isn't clear how he can deal with this threat. Knight takes f7 would fork the rooks. So you can pause the video and try to find Breyer's brilliant solution. So the passive defensive moves don't work. For example, if black plays bishop h5, defending the pawn, then e6 would follow, attacking the queen and the f7 pawn one more time. Of course, black cannot capture because of bishop takes e6, and the black queen would be lost. And for this reason, after e6, the queen must move, after which f7 would fall. So bishop h5 doesn't work. If bishop e6, then white captures the bishop, and after f takes e, white has a strong move, f5, attacking e6 for the second time, threatening to capture it. And if black captures on f5, then the e6 square is vacated and the white pawn moves forward with a tempo, followed by the invasion of the knight, again with a fork. What else can black do? How else? Bishop e6 doesn't work either. If he plays knight h6 to defend the f7 pawn, then knight takes f7, knight takes, and e6 with a fork. The queen must retreat, after which white captures, getting back the piece, and white ends up with an extra pawn and water pawn, supported by the bishop. So white is winning. So all these defensive moves don't work. But it turns out that Breyer has accumulated the sufficient amount of hidden energy, and now it's time to release it. By playing f4, white has weakened this diagonal. Besides that, his bishop is unguarded, and black major pieces are on the d file. And Breyer takes advantage of all this. He captures on e5. Threatening queen d4, check, and also attacking and winning the bishop. It turns out that white cannot capture, because after queen d4 check, king h1, queen takes c4, targeting the knight must capture. White is up the exchange, but his knight is doomed. So black would simply move away the bishop first, threatening bishop takes c3, b takes c, followed by rook d1, and that would be the end. So white must parry this threat, then the knight would move away from the rook's away, and next move, black rook would capture the knight, and black would have two minor pieces for the rook. So as knight takes f7 doesn't work, Euwe makes a prophylactic move, king h1, renewing the threat. Now he's ready to capture on f7 again. But Breyer, instead of defensive knight h6, he invites his opponent to invade the f7 square. He plays f6, attacking the knight and reinforcing the pawn. So if you remember, white used to have a pawn on this square. Now black has a pawn on this important square, central square. Besides that, it's defended by the f6 pawn. The knight invades with a fork, and now we can see Breyer's idea. There is no check anymore, but the bishop is still unguarded, and the bishop is the only defender of the knight. So Breyer attacks the bishop, knight a5. So what to do now? If white captures the rook, then black would capture. At the moment, white is up the exchange, but his knight, of course, is doomed. What else can white do? If the bishop retreats to b3, of course, black would capture, attacking the rook, and after a takes b, the knight falls. The strongest move in this position for white would have been bishop d5, recommended by computer. But of course, for human, it's very difficult to find. The idea is, after c6, black attacks the bishop one more time, the bishop retreats to f3, and now black cannot capture the knight because the queen must defend the bishop, so white bishop would capture on g4 in this case. So in this case, black would be forced to capture on f3, after which white captures on h8. The bishop is under attack, it must retreat. And although the white knight is doomed, it turns out that the black knight is also badly placed. It doesn't have any squares to retreat. The only square it can move is c4, but by playing queen e4, white would take this square away from the knight. Besides that, he would target the h7 pawn. Of course, black can save his pawn with a tempo, but after queen a4, the knight would still be under attack. The white knight is also doomed, and a very complicated tactical battle would have taken place, and computer gives a slight advantage to white. However, of course, for a human, this idea with bishop d5 followed by bishop f3 was very difficult to find. And Euwe makes a human move. As knight takes h8 doesn't work, as in the corner of the board his knight would be doomed, he finds a very interesting, original tactical idea. He captures another rook. At first sight, his knight is doomed on d8 too, but it isn't that simple. Now you will see Euwe's idea. Breyer, of course, captures the bishop, and now you can see Euwe's idea. Queen e4, attacking the knight and targeting the bishop. It turns out that black doesn't have time to capture this knight yet. Of course, he plays knight d6 with a tempo, saving his knight by attacking the queen, but now the queen moves to b4. And it turns out that, yeah, the white knight is kind of doomed, but the black minor pieces, the bishop, the knight, and the second bishop are also in danger. So white has two threats. The first one is f takes e, attacking the knight, and the knight won't be able to move because the bishop would fall. Neither can, after white captures on e5, black capture on e5, because this time the rook would capture on f8. Besides that, beside the threat of f takes e, white has another threat. He's ready to save his knight by capturing on b7. The queen is defending, would defend the knight, so the black king won't be able to capture it. Neither would the knight be able to capture it, again, because the bishop would fall. So how to deal with all these threats? Now you can pause the video and try to find another paradoxical idea by Breyer. So at first sight, black of course should capture the knight, but it doesn't work. If the queen captures the knight, then the queen would stop defending the bishop, and by playing f takes e, of course the queen would defend the bishop, the dark squared bishop, but it would stop defending the light squared bishop. And by capturing on e5, white would attack both the knight and the bishop. What else? If a black captures on d8 with the king, so that the white queen keeps defending the light squared bishop, then the dark squared bishop wouldn't be defended by the queen. And white again would capture on e5, attacking the knight, and the knight cannot move because the bishop would fall. And if black captures on e5, of course, again the bishop would fall the rook would capture it. So black cannot capture the knight at the moment. What else can he do? If he plays knight e7 so that the bishop is defended, then the knight would close the queen's file, and the white knight can escape via f7. So white would capture on e5, and after f takes e, the f file opens, the rook controls this square, and knight f7, so white saves his piece. What else? If knight h6, again defending the bishop, and this time f7 is under control, then again white would capture on e5, and after f takes e, Euwe prepared. Again, it seems that the bishop is defended, but again he saves his knight by capturing on b7, and if black captures, the rook would capture, and after rook takes, queen takes, again white is winning. But Breyer makes another paradoxical move. So his kingside isn't developed, and he moves his bishop to e7, which doesn't contribute to the development. But actually, this move solves all the problems. Now everything is defended. The bishop has left the f8 square, now it doesn't fall under attack, and the black queen still defends the light squared bishop, and black is ready to capture the knight. So Euwe captures on e5, and after f takes e, it turns out that the knight cannot escape via f7. Now that the bishop is defended by the knight, by the queen, black simply captures with the discovered attack on the white queen, so white doesn't have time to capture the knight. That's why Euwe, as knight f7 doesn't work, he captures on b7. And after knight takes b7, with the discovered attack on the white queen, Breyer has two minor pieces for the rook. So he has the material advantage. And if the white queen retreats, she cannot capture the bishop, of course, as it's defended. So if the white queen simply retreats, let's say to c4, black would simply have a big material advantage. But Euwe makes a desperate attempt to continue his attack. That's his only chance. So he sacrifices the exchange. Rook f8 check. Bishop takes f8, queen takes f8 check, and also targeting the g7 pawn. At first sight, black must play knight d8 so that the black queen keeps an eye on g7, but in this case g7 pawn still falls. After bishop g5, white is threatening to capture, and after queen takes d8, the pawn would still fall. For this reason, Breyer makes a stronger move. Instead of knight d8, he plays queen d8, letting white capture on g7, attacking both the rook and the bishop, but knight f6 defends both of these pieces. But the dark squares on black's territory are weakened, because black doesn't have the dark squared bishop anymore to defend these squares. So Euwe keeps trying. He still has the dark squared bishop, so bishop g5, pinning the knight and attacking it for the second time, threatening to capture it. And if black makes the most natural looking move, rook f8, defending the knight, that would be a terrible mistake because of bishop takes f6, eliminating the knight, which was defending the bishop. And black captures, threatening checkmate, but queen takes g4 comes with a check. And after the king moves by playing h3, white would get a much better position with an extra pawn, and his pawn structure is much better, white is winning. But instead of rook f8, Breyer makes a much stronger move, rook g8, attacking the white queen. If the queen captures on f6, then of course not queen takes f6, but rook takes g5, and the rook would be defended by the queen, and black would retain the extra piece. That's why after rook g8, instead of queen takes f6, Euwe retreats to h6. Breyer keeps attacking the queen. Rook g6, Queen h4. Now it's time to bring the knight into play. So the knight, which isn't doing anything on the queen side, comes closer to the king side. Knight d6. On the one hand, taking under control the e4 square, preventing possible knight e4, which would attack the pinned knight for the third time. And on the other hand, the black knight is heading to f5 with a tempo. Rook f1, attacking the f6 knight for the third time, but knight f5, closing the rook's file and with a tempo, attacking the queen. Euwe has no choice, he captures on g4. Knight takes g4, bishop takes d8. Now, if black captures on d8, which looks like the natural move, that would be a terrible mistake because of rook takes f5 and white is up a pawn with a winning position. But instead of king takes d8, Breyer makes an in-between move. So his knight is under attack, but he defends it with a tempo, attacking the rook. White doesn't have time to save his bishop. Neither can the rook move to d1 to defend it, because the knight also controls this square. So the rook must move, and only now king takes d8. Euwe tries his last chance to get the piece back. He plays h3, preparing g4, which would kick the knight out of f5, after which the e3 knight would fall. Neither can the e3 knight move away, because the f5 knight would fall. And if, in order to prevent g4, black carelessly captures on g2, then again rook takes f5. The knight, which was defending the rook, captures, and the rook falls, and the game would have ended in a draw. But instead of rook takes g2, Breyer makes a much stronger move, of course, rook g3. Blockading the g-pawn, now it cannot move forward, and that's the end. After rook takes, it turns out that Breyer managed to retain his extra piece and Euwe resigns. And now I recommend watching how another leading figure of hypermodernism, Richard Reti, challenges classical opening principles, creating a strategic masterpiece. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.